الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Maram, and today we'll be discussing, picking up concerning the Bab of Al-Buyu. So yeah, title concerning of these chapters, Kitab Al-Buyu, where he discuss concerning different business transactions, which is a part of Mu'amalat. And we've been covering most concerning that he mentioned regarding certain transactions that are said to be manhi'an, that transactions are said to be clearly forbidden in the Sharia. So we'll be discussing one of the hadith that covers some of these transactions that are said to be forbidden, and also those things that relates to it regarding what is mentioned in the hadith. So the hadith will be read, and then we'll go through the hadith. I would normally would do in discussing various points relating to the hadith. تفضل.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. The book of business transactions, hadith number 676, narrated Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam forbade a city dweller to sell for a man from the desert, one to bid against one another, to raise the price, that someone sell his product by cancelling the sale of his brother, to propose marriage to a woman after his brother has done so, or a woman to ask to have her sister divorced in order to deprive her of what belongs to her. Agreed upon. A Muslim must not offer a price above that offered by another Muslim.
So this is the hadith that have been read that is mentioned within this chapter, where generally that they kind of somewhat subtitle this discussion regarding an-nahi and ar-rajul ala akhi, where they subtitled as the chapter concerning it is forbidden for a Muslim and one to do a transaction over that of his brother. Then he mentioned the hadith that is narrated, mentioned anhu, meaning concerning anhu, that anhu, meaning the Sahabi who narrated this hadith, that he related the previous hadith was Abu Hurairah. So Abu Hurairah anhu had narrated the previous hadith that mentioned قال نا رسول الله عليه السلام أن يبيع الحاضر البادي. So the first thing that he mentioned the hadith, that is the Prophet the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he forbid the transaction of a person who's a city dweller of that to that of a person in the desert. وَلَا تَنَاجَشُوا, and also for you not to enter into najash. Then he mentioned وَلَا يُبِيعَ الرَّجُلَ عَلَى بِيعَ أَخِيهِ وَلَا يَخْطُبْ على خطبة أخيه ولا تسأل المرأة طلاق أختها لتكفى ما في إنائها. Then متفق عليه. Then he mentioned وللمسلم, meaning a narration of Muslim regarding this hadith, لا يصوم المسلم على صوم المسلم. So this is concerning the hadith that is mentioned here regarding this discussion. So as the normal method or system that we follow regarding concerning discussing this hadith, that first we'll mention regarding concerning the Sahabi or the narrator of the hadith, because we have mentioned previously who is something regarding this narrator was Abu Hurairah anhu, so there is no need for us to repeat this again. So we have mentioned regarding in previous lessons certain matters pertaining to Sahabi al-Jalil, who is the Ar-Rawi al-Islam, who is Abu Hurairah ta'ala anhu, because of the one of being the Sahaba who have narrated most of the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salam, are amongst the top ones. Then also, next thing that we'll mention regarding takhrij of the hadith. So giving some brief, we mentioned takhrij, where mentioning the source of the hadith, and also mention, based upon aqwal of the ulama, what they have said regarding hadith. So he mentioned regarding hadith, muttafaqun alayh. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah have cited and stated that this hadith is muttafaqun alayh, meaning hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim. So muttafaqun alayh, what he intend by this, as he outlined in the muqaddimah, in the introduction of the book, that when he used the word or the term muttafaqun alayh, this terminology, it means the hadith is agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim and narrated upon the same Sahabi. So the hadith is, so of those who have did some work on the book of Bulugh Maram, of them Sheikh Al-Laq rahimahullah ta'ala, that Muhammad Subhi Hassan Al-Laq, that is tahqiq, is checking the book of Bulugh Maram. When he mentioned this hadith, then he mentioned regarding concerning takhrij of hadith in a simple form. So takhrij at times can be short, it can be mutawassit, it can be done which is more at a medium level, and also it could be tatawwal, and could be one that goes into more detail. So a takhrij of hadith at times can be some which is somewhat basic or very short, and we're doing more of a shorter version. And then you have the one that goes above this, a more advanced, where it goes into a little more detail. Then you have the one that goes even into more detail regarding critiquing narrators and drawing other aqwal of the ulama. So that goes in more detail. So as for what is mentioned, he mentioned muttafaqun alayh, that the hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim. So as for what is mentioned here by Halaq, when he mentioned this hadith or cite this hadith or mention this hadith, he mentioned the hadith where he states akhrajahu Bukhari fi Sahihi. So the hadith is narrated by Imam Bukhari rahimahullah in Sahih. And also Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, when he mentioned this hadith, that he mentioned this hadith in many places in the Sahih. So this hadith have been scattered or been mentioned in several different places in the book of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala. Then also Imam Muslim rahimahullah also have narrated this hadith in the Sahih. Then also he mentioned Qultu, so he mentioned those who have been cited by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, which is Bukhari and Muslim. Then he wished now to add additional sources that have mentioned this hadith or collected this hadith. He mentioned akhrajahu Abu Dawood. So Abu Dawood rahimahullah has also collected this hadith and mentioned wajuz minhu akhrajahu at-Tirmidhi. So this hadith that has been mentioned, that a portion of this hadith has been mentioned by at-Tirmidhi in his al-Jami'. So Imam at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah mentioned a portion of this hadith. So he did not mention the entire hadith, but at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah mentioned some portion of this hadith. Then he mentioned an-Nasa'i, and also Nasa'i rahimahullah also narrated the hadith. And he mentioned that also the second part of the hadith, he mentioned that al-Muslim rahimahullah narrated this hadith. So that's concerning what is mentioned here by Halaq. So what he kind of somewhat have given to us, that hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim, as mentioned by the author. But also you have added to this by adding other additional books of hadith that have collected this hadith. Of those, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, by way of a portion of this hadith, and also an Nasa'i rahimahullah jami'an. So as for the next of those who have done some work regarding takhrij of this book or editing of this book, some work on this book, is Sheikh Yasin Fahl. So Yasin Fahl, one of the Mashaykh from Iraq. Then he mentioned regarding concerning when he mentioned this hadith in his check-in of Bulugh al-Maram, as we have cited before, and I've mentioned before, that you have many of the Mashaykh, wa Talabat al-Ilm, that they have done some work on the book Bulugh al-Maram. So there's many who have worked on the book of Bulugh al-Maram, that these are just some of the ones, just two of the ones that have worked on it, but there are many others. So as for what is mentioned here regarding concerning this hadith, where it can be found, or the books that have mentioned this hadith, he mentioned hadith al-Sahih, and hadith in the Bukhari and Muslim. Then he mentioned akhrajahu Abdul Razzaq in his Musannaf, Ahmed, Bukhari, Muslim, Nasa'i, Abu Yala, Ibn Jarud, wal Bayhaqi. So as for Sheikh Yasin Fahl, when he mentioned this hadith, he mentioned a hadith can be found at Abdul Razzaq in his Musannaf, Ahmed in his Musnad, also Imam Bukhari, also Imam Muslim, and the other one that were mentioned by Ibn Hajar as muttafaqun alayh. Then also An-Nasa'i, also Abu Yala in his Musnad, and also Ibn Jarud, and also Al-Bayhaqi. So these are the sources, the books of hadith that I've collected that mention this hadith. So these are the different sources that I've mentioned. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned Bukhari and Muslim, two sources. Then also if we have other sources that even extend to Kutub al-Sittah. So this hadith can be found in some of the book of Kutub al-Sittah, which is Abu Dawood, and also An-Nasa'i, and also in part at-Tirmidhi. But also this book can be found, this hadith can be found in Ahmed, and also Abu Yala, and also Ibn Jarud and Bayhaqi. So these are those who have transmitted this particular hadith. And they mentioned regarding concerning the wording of this hadith that is mentioned here is more the wording of Lafzi al-Bukhari. The wording is more that of Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala. So as for what can be said regarding concerning, so we have covered concerning takhrij of the hadith, and the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, then this indicates the hadith is authentic. So the hadith being mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim are collected together by Bukhari and Muslim, Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, then this indicates the hadith is authentic. So it doesn't need per se to go we need to go through the process of checking and verifying the aqwal of the ulama on this hadith. So as for what can be stated regarding this hadith, regarding concerning the mawdu' of this hadith, so what is the topic or the subject of the topic of this hadith? So the topic of the hadith is the portion of hadith will be the shahid from the hadith that he mentioned. This hadith it mentioned over 6 things that a Prophet of Islam are forbidden. So it mentioned over 6 different things that a Prophet of Islam are forbidden, as cited hereby as Sheikh Bassam. So Sheikh Bassam rahimahullah in his explanation mentioned وفي هذا حديث 6 أمور منهي عنه 6 أمور منهي عنه. So he mentioned there are 6 this hadith it capture or it have 6 different things that have been forbidden. So 6 different things that have been forbidden that are mentioned in this hadith. So as for the shahid, the main point from this hadith for us that relates to, as he mentioned, Nahr Rasulullah and Yubir Hadir lil Badi. So the Prophet that he forbid that the person who's a residential person or a town dweller to sell to a person who's outside in the desert. And we have discussed this before. So in the previous lessons, we have discussed concerning what is intended by this type of transaction, where the person who living in the city buying or selling from someone who's out of the city. So we have covered this before. Then it mentioned wala tanajashu. So as for tanajashu, then the Shaykh he mentioned, then he mentioned regarding la tanajas also have been covered or mentioned before. So an-najash, a type of business transaction we mentioned regarding. So we have mentioned this before, but just as a quick recap regarding what is najash, they mentioned and yazid fisila, where a person increase in the price even though they do not intend to buy the item, but they just want to increase the price so the buyer pay more. So the buyer pay more. So this is not just so a person seeing someone want to buy an item, they themselves do not wish to buy the item, but they want to increase the price. So they act as if they want the item so as to increase the sale price of the item or the cost of the item, so the seller benefit, and sometimes that with in cooperation with the buyer, with the seller, and also that person's the najis. And as mentioned before, this is haram, as Ibn Battal and others have mentioned. So we have covered that somewhat before in previous sessions. Then I mentioned regarding concerning of those matters that cover in the hadith that they mentioned here regarding concerning. So we have covered concerning those two. So those are, then I mentioned وَلَا يُبِيعَ الرَّجُلْ عَلَى بِيعِ أَخِيهِ. So the third, which is the shahid of this hadith. So the third point is the shahid of this hadith where it mentioned وَلَا يُبِيعَ الرَّجُلْ عَلَى بِيعِ أَخِيهِ, where a person is not to intervene or a person try to counter buy on his brother. So meaning, as we'll discuss, they mentioned regarding concerning what is meant by this, that a person see his brother buying an item, then he would then this person will now so this person will try now again to buy the item while his brother is trying to get the item. And they mentioned, we discussed concerning, so the person, for example, will say, one person, I want to buy this item for £10 or $10. Then the other person said no, who tried now to intervene by saying, I want this item for £12 or $12, more than the person was given initially. After somewhat, I will discuss concerning some of the ulama all concerning, after both have somewhat already agreed upon the transaction. So the person trying to increase the price or to buy the same item while his brother is buying that item. So that's concerning discussion. So that's concerning, that's a shahid, and we discuss that further regarding that matter. Then they mentioned the fourth point on this hadith, وَلَا يَخْطُبْ عَلَى خِطْبَةِ الْأَخِي, where they mentioned regarding that a Muslim, regarding they discuss concerning a Muslim that proposing in marriage to a sister already proposed to and already agreed to get married. So a person, they mentioned, no, so that's concerned that, and that will be discussed, that discussion is further in the bab of nikah. That will be discussed further in detail in the bab of nikah, but this is also of those things that are forbidden as hadith. لا يخطب على خطبة الأخي. Then they mentioned regarding ولا تسأل أمرها طلاق أختها. Then they mentioned that also for a woman not to ask, so a woman that we'll discuss concerning a woman kind of somewhat asking that either or been proposed or been someone proposed to, I have different understanding, but a woman kind of somewhat asking that either an husband to release his wife so he can marry her. So either a woman, one of the understanding is that a woman that she will say to a person who proposed to her that for me to marry you, you have to divorce your other wife and then marry me. Or a woman encouraging a woman to divorce her husband. So these are the meaning of what is taken regarding these particular things that are forbidden. So that matter regarding the other matter also we discuss more concerning the bab of talaq wa nikah, that those matter, the two last point will be discussed further in matters regarding talaq. So here in general that Sheikh Bassam, he mentioned there are 6 things that I mentioned in this hadith regarding things that are forbidden. So the first 2 that we have covered concerning and yabi' al-hadir lil-badi, the person who's a town dweller selling from someone in the desert. Then I mentioned tanajashu, then also for one not to involve in trying to increase the price, make the price high for your brother, even upon your brother. Then we mentioned a third as being the shahid from the hadith. La yubi' al-rajul ala bi' akhihi. So they mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith that what is meant by this. So Sheikh Bassam or Sheikh Al-Fawzan, which is Abdullah Fawzan. So this is concerning Abdullah Fawzan, Hafidullah Ta'ala, mentioned hadithun as his third point. He mentioned hadith dalilun ala anna la yajuz al-rajul an yubi' ala bi' akhi. That from this hadith, what can be taken, what is apparent from the hadith is that it is forbidden that for one person that he should to intervene in a transaction while his brother is involved in that transaction. And that could incidentally mention a rajul, but also could extend, which is al-ghalib, but also at the same time apply for a female and another female. So another person. So he didn't even mention a rajul, it's a sigat al-ghalib, but it doesn't say it's specific only to men. But it's also applied to one person intervening in another person or trying to interfere with another person going through with a transaction. So that's concerning what is meant by this. So we said that, so I mentioned that example that I've been given, one person want to buy an item and a person said, I'll give more, but the person yet is somewhat involved in trying to complete that transaction. They're trying to complete a transaction. So a buyer with a seller trying to complete a transaction, then a third party now intervene and then try to undo that transaction. So with this, that they mentioned, so it said bi', but also it says shara is also included. So the person is buying or selling. So the word that is used al-bi' as the word al-bi' also can take the meaning of shara, which is buying and selling. So of the ulama, so they mentioned this hadith, it also applies to the case of selling as it will apply to the case of buying. We mentioned it is also haram and not to be done. So they mentioned regarding concerning this transaction with some of the ulama, they mentioned that this hadith, that what is intended, that a person should not intervene or intercept a person while they're doing that transaction. Of the ulama mentioned that if the transaction, the agreement have been made by the buyer and the seller. So by buyer and seller have somewhat come to an agreement. They may not have yet exchanged the item, but they have come to an agreement that the transaction for them is somewhat been sealed. So I said a person, no one then at that point should intervene. No one at that point, because both have come to an agreement that they'll go through the transaction, so no one should come and intervene in that transaction regarding that same item or regarding that transaction. So of the ulama, all that's of the reason. In that case, that's when it's intended. And so he mentioned concerning mahal and nahi wa zaman al khiyarain, where can the time of the person of someone agreed, but like an option. So after that option have gone, then the person, then that's what's meant. Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, he mentioned al-zahir hadith tahrim bay'hu, that from what is apparent from the hadith is that this type of transaction is haram. That ala bi' akhi mutlaqan, regarding concern that is apparently mentioned. وظاهر الحديث تحريم البيع بيعه على بيع أخي مطلقا. That meaning that from what is apparent from the hadith, it shows that this type of transaction, interference regarding transaction, that are third party intervening, that this is haram in all cases. When I mention سواء كان, whether that is زمن الخيارين, or between the time for both, they said a grace period for them to, that they have come to the agreement, or during the transaction, or after. So at any point when a transaction that is not, one is not to do so. So one is not to do so, even during the transaction or after an agreement, then, or they have some a grace time for them to consider, then one is not allowed to intervene, because they somewhat have come to some understanding of going through the business, or understanding of going through with the transaction, but it hasn't been completed fully. So that's concerning of the view of some of the ulama regarding that matter, while others hold that they see the hadith that it is in relation to after there's an agreement to go through the sale, then no one is allowed to intervene after. So after there's an agreement or understanding to go through the transaction, then no one is allowed to intervene regarding that particular transaction. So that's concerning aqwal of the ulama regarding that particular matter. So what they mentioned, third, regarding this type of action concerning the hikmah. So concerning the hikmah behind it, they said what's the wisdom behind this? They mentioned that an-nahi, it is based upon regarding concern that a Muslim towards a Muslim regarding, then if they were to get involved in this type of transaction, it can lead asbab adawa wal-baghdha wal taqata being a Muslim, we can lead to that a Muslim can somewhat then start to have enmity towards each other, start to have malice and dislike towards each other, now start to be divided on these things. So because of these things that can be of the result of a person, a one Muslim intervening on another Muslim transaction, it can lead to these type of things. So it can lead to bad feelings between Muslim and also bad relationship between a Muslim. So based upon this, it is forbidden. Based upon this, that's of the reason, possibly the reason behind of this type of transaction said to be forbidden. So that's concerning this transaction. Then also they mention regarding concerning what is mentioned regarding another scenario regarding relating to this. If a transaction was to occur like this, so one person did intervene in a transaction between two other people conducting a transaction. So a third party intervened and he got the item. So person A and person B, buyer and seller, that they involved in a transaction, they agree to go through, but then person C now comes into play and he intervened, he intercepted the transaction and he was able to win the transaction over from the original buyer. Is it allowed for that new buyer to have the item? So they mentioned regarding the third person, the third party now who have intervened, that I mentioned that as for this transaction, if he was to intervene and is successful in that and getting that transaction from the other person, is that transaction said to be sahih? Is it a valid transaction or not? Based upon what he did is something which is haram. He intervened and intercepted that transaction. So they mentioned regarding concerning Jumhur, so on this matter, so they mentioned إذا وقع البيع على بيع الأخ. So if one person was to intervene on his brother transaction, فهل يصح البيع? Is the transaction is considered to be valid أم لا or not? So that's now the question. So they mentioned, the ulama have discussed this matter, they mentioned Jumhur ulama, so majority of the ulama من أهل العلم, from the people of ilm, على صحة البيع ما الإثم. So they mentioned that this transaction is considered to be a valid transaction because all the rules of business transaction were fulfilled except the person he falls in a sin. So he have done something wrong by interceding in that transaction, intervening, but the transaction itself, as a transaction, it is valid, but as for how he went about doing it is wrong. So how he went about doing it is wrong, so he's sinful for how he went about doing it, but as for the transaction itself, it's valid. So that's the call of Jumhur of the ulama. And they mentioned because of, so they said that it's still a valid transaction, but the person who did this, he have done something wrong and haram. The second view of the ulama, ذهب جماع من أهل العلم إلى بطلان. That a second group, a group of the ulama, some of the ulama, that they take the position that this transaction is that this batil is an invalid transaction. So the second opinion is that such a transaction is said to be invalid. And they said, no, they use concern the hadith of this hadith to say that's the case. Because the Prophet forbid, and for the Prophet and al-nahi yaqtadi al-fasad, that al-nahi stipulate that that thing becomes invalid. So they mentioned that the transaction, it is invalid. And that's the position that is taken by the matter of the Hanabila. So the matter of the Hanabila, and also a riwayah an Imam Malik, rahimahullah, and also the matter of the Zahiriyah. So of the ulama who take the position that such a transaction of a Muslim cannot a transaction against his brother, the same transaction, then they mentioned that transaction is batil, is an invalid transaction. That's the matter of the Hanabila, or the matter of the Hanabila, riwayah and narration Imam Malik, and also the matter of the Zahiriyah. So that's concerning this matter. And this view is the view of Ibn Uthaymeen, of contemporary Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, that is in agreement or is sided with the second view, that the batil is invalid. And the Shari Fat Al-Lam, which one of those have explained, the book Bulugh Maram, that he more inclined towards that view. So he's more inclined towards that view. So you find that, so that's the discussion between ulama. Those who hold Jumhur take that the transaction is still valid, but there's ithm, there's sin involved for a person who did so, who did that act. And the second view, which is some of the ulama have taken, is that that transaction, it is batil, is an invalid transaction. And the person, and that, and we have mentioned that the reason based upon the clear-cut hadith that is cited. So that's concerning of that matter. By extension, what they have added now to this discussion regarding buying on your brother's transaction, they mention al-bay al-dhimmi. So they mention that, okay, a Muslim, two Muslim committing a Muslim and a non-Muslim doing a transaction. A Muslim and a non-Muslim, that non-Muslim is a dhimmi. So dhimmi means the person is under the Muslim, so the Muslim and the Muslim have some type of agreement with. So there's an agreement with them regarding that, so that non-Muslim with that Muslim doing a transaction, then another Muslim, a third party who's a Muslim, then he wants to now intercept that transaction. Is this allowed? Because the first dimension is because akhi, he mentioned concerning a Muslim with a Muslim, but is the same thing that applies to one Muslim to another Muslim, in this case apply with a dhimmi, is this allowed? So with this matter, you have a discussion between the ulama, where you find that after all the ulama, all that, what applies regarding a Muslim to another Muslim, regarding this type of transaction is haram. Also the same thing applies regarding this type of transaction is haram regarding a Muslim trying to intervene on a sale of a dhimmi, a non-Muslim who's the Muslim have some agreement with, that they live in peace with them. So it mentioned regarding concerning ajaza, of those who say they're given allowance for this, awza'i. Some of the ulama, the Shafi'iyya, so you have those who mention it is permissible. Of those who mention it's permissible, then you find that Jumhur of the ulama min al-ilm that mention that أجاز ذلك أوزاهي and تأكيد مدخور. they mention ذهب الجمهور من أهل العلم إلى أن التقييد خرج مخرج الغالب قولهم بعدم جواز ذلك, where they said no, this is not per se allowed. So of the ulama who mention, which is Jumhur of the ulama, who say that when they mention akhi or Muslim regarding makhraj al-ghalib, they're talking about in most cases, but also this does not apply to them regarding that most cases. But as for a non-Muslim, then this would not apply to them. So even among so they said this rule does not apply to a non-Muslim. So there's an exception. So the rule is that for them, Jumhur, it applies between a Muslim. As for the non-Muslim, then it doesn't apply the same. So they mentioned that so that's concerning that matter, regarding concerning that, a discussion between both the ulama who some give a permissibility and some who all that is not permitted. Then the next matter that leads to this, the mention regarding concerning what relates specifically to business transaction, that I mentioned in some of the narration of the hadith, that it mentioned regarding that it mentioned wala yasum wala samia al muslim ala sawm al muslim wala sam'a سمع يسمو أو يسمي المسلم على سم مسلم. They discuss concerning a transaction is called مزايدة. So you have a transaction called مزايدة. So مزايدة is a form of transaction where that is what they call auction. So the type of auction, that the type of so they discuss concerning auction. What's the permissibility of auction? Where auction, where it is understood that is the item go to the highest bidder. So it's understand that a group of people will try to get a particular item, but the item will be sold to the person who's the highest bidder. So that's the understanding. So that's concerning that type of auction. So that's what we intend by auction. So auction by way of the person who's willing to pay the highest will be the one that will gain the item. So but many people will compete in trying to gain that item, but it will be given to the person with the highest bid. So that's concerning that type of, say, public auction. They mentioned regarding concern this matter, regarding concern that ذهب, they mentioned that ذهب جمهور أهل العلم إلى جواز ذلك. So Jumhur, majority of the ulama, they take the position that public auction, it is something which is jaiz. So public auction, it is something which is jaiz, something which is permissible. To the extent he mentioned, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ نَقَلَ إِجْمَاع, that even some of the ulama said that there is an ijma on this matter. So some of the ulama have mentioned, have cited that there is an ijma, that there is a consensus on public auction. Then they mentioned, but the Jumhur of they mentioned, but and of those who say that ijma, you have Ibn Qudama, Ibn Abdul Barr. They mentioned وذلك أن الأصل في المعاملات هو الجواز حتى يأتي دليل التحريم. So they mentioned that the reason for they've come to the conclusion that it is permissible because the also concern muamalat and certain muamalat general transaction is that it is allowed until there is something specific to say otherwise. So it is allowed until we have something by way of the Shara to say it is not, legislature say it is not allowed, so we go with allowance. And they mentioned regarding concerning that hadith that have been mentioned regarding, so that's the view that they take. So that's the first view of the ulama who hold that it is allowed. Then they mentioned regarding that a second position of the ulama regarding public auction, that Ibrahim an-Nakhai is of the view it is something which is the concept karya, that he dislike of this. So you see that something which is disliked. So you see that something which is disliked, al-bay muzayada. So this type of auction, public auction, that Ibrahim an-Nakhai from the ulama of the Salaf who are all concerned is something which is disliked, karahiyah. And he come to that conclusion that he mentioned is a hadith of the Prophet of Islam that he mentioned that Sufyan ibn Wahb in the Bazaar that have stated أن النبي الإسلام أنه قال أن the Prophet of Islam have said أن النبي الإسلام نهى عن بيع مزايدة. نهى نبي الإسلام عن بيع مزايدة. So he mentioned that this particular hadith that is in Bazaar that I mentioned, لكن hadith daif. That hadith is daif. So a discussion between ulama regarding of the ulama or the hadith is daif. And I mentioned that da'af في الإسناد concerning Ibn Lahiyah. So Ibn Lahiyah is in the Isnad. So they understand. وَلَمْ يُتَابِعْ عَلَيْهِ, and no one also sees a single narrator on this, and no one else also have coincide with him. So based upon this, that they mentioned the hadith is daif, even though there's a discussion regarding Ibn Lahiyah. So regarding concerning this narrator who is Abdullah ibn Lahiyah, that is a lengthy discussion regarding this narrator, but the old concern to know is that Isnad is daif regarding Ibn Lahiyah rahimahullah. But overall they all that. So that's the second view, karahiyah. The third position, the third position on this, our view, Jan Awza'i wa Ishaq, that both were mentioned that qalu or qala, that's it, it's allowed regarding things regarding maga'im, regarding concerning ganaim, regarding concerning things regarding that crops, regarding concerning cattles and crops. So they consider they give a certain leeway regarding to certain livestock. So that's concerning the view of Awza' and Ishaq. Regarding livestock, they give some permissibility regarding this type of public auctioning. Other than that, no. And so also, so that's concerning their view regarding that matter. And I mentioned overall regarding concerning what those who have said, given some, who have said no, it is not allowed, impermissibility, that what they have used in most cases considered hadith either, that is not per se a hadith that are considered to be authentic. So the hadith that they are used to say it is not, that it is not allowed, that's hadith that they old, of those who hold, that those hadith are not authentic. So the that in the code of Jumhur of ulama seems more correct. So the code of Jumhur of ulama, that is something which is, it is allowed to be done, and in type of, so that's concerning the matter on what they refer to as public auction. So public auction, then as we mentioned, that is Jumhur ulama take the position it is something which is allowed. And I mentioned regarding to a certain of hadith Ahmed, where I mentioned that the hadith in the Abu Dawud, with Tirmidhi, Ahmed, and others, and Nabi Islam, Baha, Amata, and I mentioned Freeman, Yazid, and I mentioned, no, is there anyone that wished to increase on this other item that to be sold? And they were asking, so is there anyone that wished to increase on this? So I mentioned, says that based upon this, it shows regarding it is something which is allowed. Even I mentioned in the Isnad is a narrator who's majhul. So even though in the Isnad is narrated is majhul, so you have that discussion between the ulama on this matter regarding is it permissible, the permissibility of public auction. Those who say yes, which is the Jumhur, and those who say no, with some stipulations. So karahiyah, or those who limit it to livestock and the like, then that's concerned aqwal of the ulama. So that inshallah ta'ala, then so those are the main masail that relates to bab al-tijara. These are the main masail that relates to bab al-tijara. So from this, it shows regarding of the fawaid of Islam, of the benefit from the hadith. It shows, and also said that the other parts regarding a man, regarding seeking marriage, and also a woman seeking of divorce. Those matters we discussed regarding bab al-talaq at that point. So in the bab of talaq, then that discussion will be covered more in detail in the bab of talaq. So as for what is mentioned in the hadith here regarding of the first 3 points, regarding concerning matters relating to certain type of business transaction that are mentioned, then we have covered those transactions that are stated there. The first 2 were covered previous, and the one that they mentioned, that the additional one that I mentioned here, then we have covered what is said by the ulama pertaining to those type of transaction. So that inshallah ta'ala, we have covered most of the main points of this hadith. So from the fawaid of this hadith, it shows regarding that Islam, that regarding concerning trying to maintain brotherhood and keeping good brotherhood between the Muslim, that is something that Islam take into account. And by this, that anything that may disrupt this, or may break this, or interfere with the Muslim brotherhood and unity, and keeping good ties and relationship with the Muslim, then Islam come to eradicate those things. So even in matters concerning business transaction, even to the extent regarding concerning marriage and marriage life, that Islam also try to put a balance to this, where one should not try to interfere with something that's already established regarding Muslim brotherhood, but always try not to anything that may create any form of animosity or dislike or mistreatment to another Muslim or others. Then Islam try to remove those things. So even in business transaction and in other family related matters. So that's all the things. So of the Muslims should to know that we to pay attention to this matter and to know the rights of one Muslim to another. It is something which is of great significance. So that inshallah ta'ala, that will end of this discussion, and this in this particular bab regarding bab al-buyu, and he mentioned bab shuruti wa ma nuhi an, and those things that are forbidden. So that inshallah ta'ala will end. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه إلى سبيل والآخر دعوانا الحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.